Developing the framework of a nation, the United States under the Articles of Confederation. On April 19, 1783, Thomas Paine drafted the last of his American Crisis Papers. He wrote, "The times that tried men's souls are over, and the greatest and completest revolution the world ever knew, gloriously and happily accomplished." Paine was correct in that the military phase of the revolution had come to a conclusion. However, the Americans had yet to construct an enduring and a united nation. Having secured the peace, the United States must now build a nation. The years from 1783 through 1787 are sometimes depicted as a sterile period in the nation's history. Yet Americans wrestled with some of the most fundamental questions regarding the form of the nation during this period. Its trials and tribulations would yet again challenge men's souls, and in the end, they prompted Americans to create a model form of representative government. This video will examine the failures and successes of the Articles of Confederation, understand the role of state governments as a federal model, and analyze the federal framework and the principles of government. The Articles of Confederation were actually adopted much earlier than the post-war period. They were adopted November 15, 1777, and ratified March 1, 1781. In fact, they had actually been written about 2 or 3 years prior to their adoption, but the colonies, the future states, if you will, were slow in finally adopting them. What exactly were the Articles? What was their framework? How did they function? Well, the answer to these questions is really found in the preamble to the Articles. It states, and I quote, "The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatsoever." So some of the key phrases here. First of all, firm league of friendship. So not necessarily a nation state in the sense that we know it today. Much of the reasons for creating this league of friendship are similar to that of creating the Constitution of the United States of America. But there are other phrases we can look at also. Assisting each other. Not necessarily coming together in one unified body. Looking at the actual articles, how exactly did they work? Well, first of all, they decided things based upon state votes. Each state had one vote, and each state sent roughly 2 to 7 delegates. The composition and the selection of this delegation was determined by the respective states. There was a secretary and a president that presided over Congress, but it was not a president in the sense of the United States president today. This individual did not really command his own department, his own branch of government. If anything, he was just the leader, if you will, of this body of state delegates. The next important thing to understand is what powers were delegated to the states. Well, there were quite a few. They could levy duties and imposts coming into their borders. They could levy taxes. They could pass internal laws. They could print paper money. They could even maintain a militia for their own defense. Looking at these, some are powers that states still possess today. Today, a state can levy a state tax. They still can pass internal laws. But certain of these rights, certain of these privileges are no longer possessed by them, such as the right to levy a duty or an impost or to print paper money. So what power did the Continental Congress have? Well, it was clearly stated in the Articles that Congress only had those powers expressly delegated to it. In other words, if it was not stated in the Articles, Congress did not have that power. The powers they did possess were to make treaties, confederations, and alliances. They could declare peace and war, arbitrate disputes between states. They had control over Native American affairs. They were expected to establish and maintain a postal system. They could equip, maintain, and build an army and navy. They could borrow money and emit bills of credit. And they also had control over Western lands. Essentially, what they were looking at when it came to the Continental Congress was to provide a single body that external powers could establish relationships with. So if we look at most of their powers, many of them deal with, for example, foreign states. So that's what making treaties, alliances, etc. is for, declaring peace and war. They could maintain, build an army and a navy. In addition to that, you'll notice that Native American affairs are listed in here as well. This is understandable considering the fact that Native American tribes were still considered separate states, although they resided, according to Americans' mindset, within the United States borders. Of course, the postal system is understandable in that it would link together all of the different states, and a government that was representative of all of the state's interests would be best to run such a system. In addition to that, the Continental Congress had control over Western lands, but this was a little more difficult than it's stated, considering the fact that all of the states still laid claim to all of the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, there is one key power that was granted to them that is important to look at. Congress was granted the right to borrow money and emit bills of credit. But you'll notice levying taxes was not in there. So how exactly were they expected to equip, maintain, and build an army and a navy? Needless to say, there were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation. First of all, there was the issue of debt. With the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the United States of America committed itself to repaying all debt still owed to both Great Britain as well as individual British citizens. On top of that, they had opened trade with the Empire of France, and this trade brought with it debt as well. So how exactly were they expected to repay all of this debt that they assumed if they could not levy taxes? In addition to that, there were problems with diplomacy. When France finally decided to send diplomats to the United States of America following the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War, one of the problems that they had was they did not know where exactly to send their ambassador. So their solution was this number right here, magical number 14. 1 went to the Continental Congress, 13 to the individual states. The United States of America, now that it was separate from Great Britain, could trade with other states. They were no longer bound to the mercantilist policies of the British Empire. The thing about trade, though, is it's great to do, especially on an international level with all that revenue you can bring in. The only problem is that you have to be able to protect your merchants abroad. And this was one thing that the United States of America could not do. In North Africa, there were people known as Barbary pirates. They came from areas that were located in modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, and they preyed upon shipping in the Mediterranean. They were hard enough to deal with for the French and the British and the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Italians, basically any nation that traded in this area. So how exactly was this young nation supposed to engage them, supposed to protect their shipping when they didn't even have a navy? There was another incident that occurred that really drove home the problems with the federal government. And this was the Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783. Basically, what this all revolved down to was, once again, the issue of debt. The Continental Congress was unable to generate enough money during the American Revolution to pay its soldiers or even to equip them. During the American Revolution, they had accumulated large amounts of debt, especially to Dutch merchants that basically supplied the war effort. Following the conclusion of the Revolution, they still had a lot of these debts that were unpaid, including the issue of back pay to many of their soldiers. In the last week of December 1782, 3 high-ranking officers who were stationed with the army at Newburgh, New York, delivered a petition on behalf of the army to Congress. And the petition claimed that the officers and the soldiers had not been paid and that their personal funds were running out. They reminded Congress of a promise it made in 1780 to resolve this issue and also to provide officers with half-pay pensions for life. They proposed a solution. They told Congress that they were willing to forego larger debts if all back pay was granted and if they simply gave a lump sum to the officers. They also issued a warning, that of a possible mutiny if action was not taken immediately. The situation escalated to March 10, 1783, when the officers issued the Newburgh Address. It chided the nation for its ingratitude towards the soldier. It denounced Washington's refusal to take sides during the controversy. And the officers also threatened to disband should Britain decide to invade once again, and they would refuse to demobilize should Congress demand it. Needless to say, right off the bat, Congress was facing the serious threat of a coup by the military. So who did they turn to? Once again, they turned to General George Washington. On March 15, 1783, a meeting was held at the Temple of Honor, which was newly constructed for the officers to gather. Here, Washington performed brilliantly. He began his speech by denouncing their actions and of abandoning their country in, quote, the extremest hour of her distress. He appealed to their reason and their virtue, promised that Congress would take care of their financial distress. While he was giving the speech, he pulled out a letter that he said was relevant to the issue. Before reading it, he stopped and pulled out his spectacles, and he said in a low tone, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The sight of their leader, suddenly a man grown old in the service of his country, hit the officers. By the time he left the Temple of Honor, the conspiracy had effectively ended. Shortly after this, there was the controversy surrounding the Society of the Cincinnati, which was established in May 1783. This was an organization suggested by General Henry Knox and headed by George Washington. The basic purpose of the Cincinnati was to raise funds for widows and orphans of the Revolutionary War, to promote Revolutionary War casualties, promote closer unions, in other words, closer connections among the veterans. And it made only Continental officers eligible for membership. Their eldest sons would basically inherit their place in the society, and if no eldest son or direct descendant existed, then it would go to the closest person to a relative that they could find. With the Newburgh conspiracy fresh on people's minds, this caused an outrage. Congress had already been threatened by a potential military coup, and people were incredibly wary of the idea of military control over the newly found country. In addition to that, there was their distrust of standing armies. Standing armies were often associated with absolutist governments, such as those found in France or in Spain or in many of the German states. In response, the society dropped the rule of dissent, and it placed its funds under control of the state legislatures. Now, not everything amounted to a failure under the Continental Congress. They successfully created a Bank of America, which opened on January 1782. It had some success, generated private investors, handled government finances, and loaned government money in times of need. but it was also a highly divisive issue. Merchants and speculators would oftentimes rack up debts from the bank and then go into insolvency when the loans were due. In addition to that, they issued paper money, a concept that was still new in economies at this point. And then finally, the loans that the bank offered for industry and for business were limited really to the wealthier merchants within society. So poorer farmers and businesses in the interior could not find sources of income from this national institution. Another success during the time of the Continental Congress was the creation of an egalitarian society. The masses began to conceive of equality as leveling all social groups. Now, this does not necessarily mean leveling all economic classes. And basically, they viewed it as no longer needed for certain social conventions. Since everybody was equal, nobody, regardless of wealth, could be above another individual. You no longer needed to doff your hat if a gentleman walked by you on the street. Workers absolutely refused to be called servants. Now they went by the title help. So this end of aristocracy ushered in this new belief in social mobility for those who worked hard. Social mobility for people who had once been limited by their birth. In addition to that, with the defeat of the British Empire, the Church of England was no longer the state religion. So now Catholics, Jews, Quakers, people who were once labeled with the pejorative term dissenter, not only could conceive of a future in which they had full access to society and to economies, but even to professions that were once barred to them. Liberal state laws also allowed more people to vote. Keep in mind, the vote was still at this time limited to adult white males who owned property, but these property qualifications were lowering, so that approximately 50 to 80% of adult white males at this time had the right to vote, although on average only 36% actually chose to use it. Now, at this time, it's important to understand that political leaders never really intended to create a truly leveled society. Many of the framers of the Constitution, for example, had a very low opinion of the masses. John Adams, at one point, often referred to them as the brutish masses. And when they came together in 1787 to frame the Constitution, one of the things that they would do was to create what were called democratic filters. This is one of the reasons why individual Americans could vote for members of the House of Representatives, but not their senators until the 1800s. By having the senators elected by representatives from states, the framers thought that what they were doing was limiting how much democracy was practiced in the United States. Another institution that they would later build into the Constitution was the Electoral College. The Electoral College also acted in this manner. The president was not elected by the people. The popular vote just simply indicated which way the states were expected to vote when they chose electors. And electors early in the nation's history had a large degree of liberty. They could, in essence, vote their own conscience. Today we still have the Electoral College, and today we still debate over it as to whether or not it's an institution that should continue to exist, or if this democratic filter is simply one more legacy of this inegalitarian strain within American society that was present in its early years. Now, another thing that the Congress succeeded in doing was getting states to cede all of their claims to Western lands, and this was important for Congress. The Continental Congress basically understood that if they could not tax, the only revenue they were going to get was through the sale of land. This power was granted to them in the Articles. But, as you can see from the map, all of the states laid claim to the lands that they had seized from the British Empire. Basically, when kings issued charters during the colonial era, they often included language that said the colony was allowed to exist at a certain point along the eastern seaboard and extending to the west. So it was very vague where exactly it ended. So usually, Massachusetts and New York would lay claim to the same lands that lay west of the Appalachian Mountains, if we were to draw a straight line. Virginia likewise lay claim to much of the land that was west of the Appalachian Mountains, as did Georgia, as did North Carolina, South Carolina. So what Congress needed to do and what they succeeded in by the early 1800s, Georgia being the last here in 1802, was to get all of the states to recognize that their claims ended with their western borders. With this, Congress began the process of organizing all of this territory for settlers and for later statehood. Two of the pieces of legislation that were passed under the Continental Congress remained with the United States of America all the way through the 1800s and even into the 1900s. Much of the system that they developed continued on in how we admitted states as late as the 1950s, with Alaska and Hawaii being the last of the two. In Europe, there were two traditional ways that societies surveyed land for private ownership. One was the metes and bounds system. So if you had a river right here, your land would usually border a river, and then language within the deed would extend to, say, some hills out here in the west, or maybe some other landform that could be identified, and that was your territory. This is different from the system that was very popular in France, which was called the long lot system, in which it would start at usually one feature, such as a river, and then extend backward a given amount of land. Many of the framers of the Constitution and the delegates at the Continental Congress were landowners. Keep in mind, landowning was a major business in this time period, as agriculture was the primary source of employment for many people. Delegates of Congress had, like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, had actually spent time as surveyors, actually going out and marking people's boundaries. And so one thing that they had developed through a practical knowledge was what worked and what did not work with surveying the land. The system that they came up to replace the old metes and bounds and long lot system was the Land Ordinance of 1785. They came up with a novel and rather ingenious system called the Township and Range Survey System. What they did is they started on a point west of the Appalachian Mountains at modern-day Liverpool, Ohio, and they said, okay, we are going to divide up the land into successive ranges. And each range would be further divided into a township. Within the township, they would divide it up into sections of 1 square mile or 640 acres with 36 sections per township. These sections would then be sold for a market price and later settled. Now, one of the things that they envisioned with this legislation was a future of Republican landowners. And one thing that the founding nation of the Republic realized was if you were going to be a participating citizen within a republic, you had to be educated because you needed to know what you were voting about. So to that end, they also included in there language that stated that each township had to set aside one section for the establishment and the maintenance of a school. So there you have the two key elements that they envisioned for a Republican society: land ownership for individual families to establish a farm and a livelihood, and a school nearby to teach them the values and the knowledge needed to be participating members as landowners. Now, there is one question. What about the church? Keep in mind that the founding generation of the United States of America had lived within a society that had an established church, and that was the Church of England. All subjects of the British Crown were expected to pay tithes to it, regardless of whether or not you were an Anglican, a Quaker, a Congregationalist, a Presbyterian, a Methodist, or a Catholic. One thing that this generation decided as they were passing this law was that since they were in a new era, in a new government with the right of religious freedom, the government would not support churches. A community could establish a church, they could maintain a church, but this was something that they would have to do on their own, based upon their own conscience. As a result of the township and range system contained within the Land Ordinance of 1785, you have the creation of the modern state shapes. What they essentially did is they started here in Ohio, and they just rolled it westward as settlement extended along, which is one reason why in the United States of America we have these very unique state shapes that end in all of these right angles. Now, in addition to the Land Ordinance of 1785, there was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So I have a little error here. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 came behind the Land Ordinance and said, okay, this is how we are actually going to establish new states. They had been colonies once, and so they had no intention of making settlers live in parts of the country that were not organized so that they could have full participation rights as citizens. The Land Ordinance had generated a system of how exactly land was to be surveyed and sold. The Northwest Ordinance came behind and gave a system of how it was to be governed. So the Northwest Ordinance organized all of this territory here north of the Ohio River into a territory that would later be redivided into at least 5 future states. In this territory, slavery would be prohibited. Keep in mind, the Enlightenment had brought into question the institution of slavery. And in fact, in many of these new states, the future of slavery was being settled. Many of the northern states had already moved within their state governments towards the abolition of slavery. And at this time, slavery in many of the southern states was being called into question as well. It would not be until the advent of cotton as a marketable, mass-produced cash crop that slavery would be fully entrenched into the economy of the southern states, and the southern states would turn into an ardent slave society. The law was there in the form of the Barbados Codes. Ownership had already been established over many of the slaves. But at this time, there was still the question, would it continue to exist? Would it be economically viable? Of course, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin would complicate this question, as its viability suddenly was reassessed and cotton started to become a viable cash crop. But it would not be until the major demand for cotton caused by the Industrial Revolution that suddenly slavery, its profitability, would, within the Southern mind, become unquestionable as cotton became king. Now, another thing that the Northwest Ordinance did is it guaranteed basic rights to settlers, rights that foreshadowed those that would be enshrined in the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. Now, the next question becomes, what is the process? What happened in the territories? Well, once they divided up these territories into different, region into different territories, each territory would enter into its district phase. Each territory would have a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges appointed by the President of Congress. They would provide the early stages of government. Once 5,000 settlers moved into a territory, they could vote for they could organize a legislative assembly to pass local laws, and they could elect a congressional delegate to Congress. Keep in mind, though, that this congressional delegate was a non-voting member. This is something that we still have today in the United States of America. Today, Puerto Rico exists as a Commonwealth territory in the United States of America and continues to send a delegate, non-voting delegate, to Congress, as does Guam. Now, once the population had reached 60,000 settlers, they could then organize a constitution and apply for statehood. This was the process that would continue throughout U.S. history, with some exceptions, those being Texas, California, Hawaii, all of which skipped the territorial phase, and Puerto Rico, which never became a state, but still has that unique status of within the United States Commonwealth. As the 1780s continued on, these problems within the Articles of Confederation became more and more evident. One of the first moments where political leaders in the United States sought to address these issues was at the Mount Vernon Conference. The Mount Vernon Conference was called over problems with the Potomac River. It separated Maryland from Virginia, and it was a major hub of major route for transportation and trade. The only problem was that transport vessels and merchants oftentimes found the competing duties, imposts, and laws that existed in Maryland separate from Virginia and vice versa as meddlesome and problematic for trade. Sometimes what merchants would do is unload on one side of the river that was most favorable in terms of an impost and then just transport the items over. There were other problems as well. For example, if there were obstructions in the river, if improvements were needed for navigation, who paid for them? Was it Congress? Was it Virginia? Or was it Maryland? So the conference met on March 25th, 1785 at George Washington's house and concluded 3 days later. One thing that it was agreed on was that the Potomac River would be considered a common highway, and therefore both sides would have to come up with policies to deal with these issues jointly. They also came up with a way to split the costs for these improvements, such as lighthouses, beacons, and buoys. But before they adjourned, they agreed to meet again at Annapolis with other states to continue this discussion of issues of national concern. The Annapolis Convention met in 1786. It was a convention held by the invitation of the Virginia State Legislature to discuss common policies and to regulate commerce. Maryland, though, did not necessarily participate, although it did finally agree to host it in one of its own cities, that of Annapolis. No one from New England or the lower southern states attended, But it did end up producing the address of the Annapolis Convention on September 14, 1786. And the address noted that there were, quote, important defects in the system of the federal government, and urged Congress to call a convention to, quote, meet at Philadelphia on the second Monday in May of 1787. Congress later adopted the recommendations of the Annapolis Convention on February 21st, and they called a convention to meet in Philadelphia for, quote, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein. There's key language here. For the sole express purpose of revising the Articles. In 1787, what would essentially happen is that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention ended up really committing treason in a sense. They went above and beyond their stated purpose, that which the Continental Congress and the states had authorized, and ended up creating a whole new system of government that would later replace the Articles. Now, the final event that was a straw, if you will, that really just kind of made this need for a new government clear to everybody was Shays' Rebellion of 1786 to 1787. Basically, there were two patterns that were happening in American society. On the one hand, you had within the economy increases in taxes. As states and as the Confederated government realized that they needed to maintain their own improvements and their own defenses, they had to raise their own revenue. But at the same time that they were raising revenue, money was becoming more and more scarce. Before, the colonies had been incorporated into the British imperial system of government. So much of the monetary policy that government required was determined by Parliament. Now, however, you had a system in which there were 13 different state governments with 13 different types of currency, 13 different monetary policies, and no unifying force to bring these policies in line together. And there was also a shortage of specie, or gold and silver, that was needed to coin and mint currency that actually carried value. To this end, landowners, small farmers in the hinterland, in areas deeper into the western portions of states, found themselves going further and further into debt, often having to pull out loans and credit just to make ends meet. As this gap increased, so too did their inability to pay. Now, today, Americans can generally resort to bankruptcy for most of their debts, with the exceptions of credit cards and student loans. In this time period, if you couldn't pay, there was only one thing left: an institution known as debtor's prison. A prison where you were held until your family could come up with the funds to settle your debts. Oh, and keep in mind, while you were in prison, you were expected to provide for your own upkeep. Farmers in Massachusetts finally turned to the state, hoping for some sort of relief. The result was nothing. The state government refused to help. And debtors in prisons populations only continued to increase by 200 to 300% in some counties. Some of these prison inmates even included war veterans. Finally, it reached a head when an individual by the name of Daniel Shays led an outright rebellion. He was 39 at the time, a veteran who had fought at Bunker Hill, Bemis Heights, and Stony Point. He was experienced in politics. He had barely managed to stay out of debtor's prison, and he had connections. Shay and his lieutenants trained their men, and then they launched an attack against the state government. The rebellion was put down after a failed attack on the Springfield Arsenal, but only after both Massachusetts and the Continental Congress worked together. Even though Shay himself was defeated, at the national level, his rebellion sparked other backcountry rebellions and protests. Congress was looking at a crisis, how to resolve these issues. The Constitutional Convention ended up being the answer. Even though these individuals went well beyond their authorized purpose, they did develop a solution that would continue the nation into its present day. It was at the Pennsylvania State House that 55 delegates met from May 25th to September 17th of 1787. Now, one of the things that we have to ask is who was there and who was not there. Well, not in attendance were John Adams, John Jay, and Thomas Jefferson, as they were abroad as delegates. Patrick Henry absolutely refused because he, quote-unquote, smelled a rat. Who was there? Well, you had illustrious names such as George Washington, James Madison, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Eldridge Gerry, Rufus King, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, a group of individuals steeped in Enlightenment thought, experienced in government and business, and individuals who had been active during the Revolutionary War. Now, one thing about the Constitutional Convention is that they did not actually start from scratch. They had a long history of creating and maintaining these new forms of government that were unlike forms of government that had been seen in Europe. For example, the experience came from the creation of state constitutions. State constitutions all were mixed governments within the United States at this time. They all were written constitutions, and this is crucial. Constitutions were not new at this time. You actually had in Great Britain something known as the British Constitution. But the British Constitution was not a written document. It was a series of laws and traditions that had been passed down year from year, built on from one successive generation to another. This time it would be one written document. In addition to that, state constitution included within them bills of rights. This was something that they borrowed directly from their English experience. During the Glorious Revolution, before King William and Queen Mary could assume the throne, one thing they had to agree on was a Bill of Rights that stated in no uncertain terms what rights British subjects maintained. Another thing that they had done was, in creating this mixed government with a system of checks and balance as borrowed from Montesquieu, was to address two tricky issues. One was that of the executive. How to create an executive branch without making it a tyranny. The answer there was that they limited the powers of the executive, and this was an experience they had learned from dealing with colonial governments. So going into these state governments, it was actually the state legislatures that usually held most of the power. The second was the issue of the judiciary. In order to execute a law, people believed at the time that it was necessary to sit in judgment over the laws that you were executing. So how do you separate these two powers? They did this by giving certain powers to the executive branch, but reserving for their judiciary the right to actually sit in judgment over laws. Now, finally, one of the biggest issues that they had with Parliament during the years leading up to the American Revolution was the issue of virtual representation. Remember, Parliament always dismissed these calls of no taxation without representation with the phrase, you are virtually represented. Even though you do not vote on members of Parliament work in your best interest. Did they end up resolving virtual representation? The answer to that question is absolutely not. Keep in mind, the right to vote within states and then later within the federal government of the United States was limited to white male adults who owned property. It would only be through degrees that universal male suffrage was attained in the 19th century. Women's right to vote would not come until the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. And African Americans, even though they were guaranteed the right to vote in the 14th Amendment, their right to vote was not secured until the Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s was passed and until the federal government started to take direct and deliberate action to stop discrimination within the southern states, as well as to clamp down on terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. At the Constitutional Convention, delegates there benefited from the presence of one young man by the name of James Madison. James Madison had written an essay not long before the convention that gave inspiration to Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who introduced the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan envisioned a national government that rested on a popular foundation. There would be 3 branches of government. There would be a legislature, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And the legislative branch would be further divided into 2 different houses. One house would represent the people, the other house representing the states. The only catch with the Virginia Compromise is that in the Virginia Compromise, everything depended on population. So states such as Virginia, for example, would benefit because they were the largest states with the largest populations. To counter this was the New Jersey Plan. So this was introduced on June 15th by William Paterson of New Jersey. And basically what it called for was just simply expanding the rights already given to in Congress to include such things as the right to tax or levy duties or regulate trade and commerce, but not necessarily to recreate a new government. One of the reasons why is centralization threatened smaller states, in that larger states would be able to dominate the conversation through population size. On June 16th, the Connecticut Compromise was introduced by Roger Sherman. This later became known as the Great Compromise. And what they came up with was a brilliant solution. The House of Representatives would be determined by population. The Senate, however, would be determined by sending 2 delegates from each state. Thus, the size of the states would influence the origination of laws through the House of Representatives, but then the smaller states could always maintain a check on these larger states through their representation in the Senate. Now, another issue that they had to resolve was that of slavery. Many of the slave-owning states, such as Virginia, wanted slaves to be counted as part of the head count that determined representation. States further in the north that did not have a large slave population did not want this slave populations counted. After all, if the person is not considered free, if that person is not even treated as a human being within the law, how can you count them as a human being when it came to apportioning representatives? The end here would be the 3/4 compromise, or 3/5 compromise. Basically, slaves would be counted for 3/5 of an individual. Once this had been determined, all that was left to do was to work out the details and write the document. The Committee of Detail was established on June 26th, and they went through and dealt with all the nuts and bolts in terms of language. After that, on September 10th, the Committee of Style put the finishing touches on it. Kind of did the proofreading, gave it a little bit of style. And then finally on September 17th was the final day when the Constitution was read aloud and the vote taken. 10 states to none voted for it. South Carolina was divided. New York had left with only Hamilton remaining when their demands were not met, and Rhode Island had declined to attend altogether. In the end, only 39 of the 55 delegates actually put their signature on the document, but nonetheless, they went through with their plans of sending it to the people to vote. Now, here's where the state constitutions came back into power. One of the big questions was, how do you ratify it? Does it go to the states? Does it go directly to the people? In the end, they chose the method that was adopted in the states themselves. The state constitution, they viewed, was directly representing the people by the delegates actually being sent there. When it actually came to ratification, though, they sent it not to the people for a general vote, but instead to the different towns. And towns were often ones that actually determined whether or not the state constitution went into power. So as such, they viewed the 55 delegates viewed themselves as already representing the people when they met in Philadelphia to determine what they were going to do with the new government. So for ratification, what they did is they sent that to the states. So the Constitution of the United States, what did they send to the states for ratification? Well, here you can see in the preamble a very different form of government from that which they tried to establish under the Articles of Confederation. It starts off at the very beginning saying, "We the people of the United States." So right there is that concept of the people not relinquishing their power that comes from John Locke. There is the thoughts of Rousseau with the general will of the people. But the people of the United States forming a more perfect union to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain this and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So one thing that was in their mind was, how exactly do we make this government work through the ages? And one thing that was in their mind is that this would be a government that would unite the states. So in Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. And within this, it gave to Congress now all the power, many of the powers that it had denied in the past. So now state legislatures, they would be allowed to tax or post internal taxes, but taxes across the board, this was for Congress only. Congress alone could mint money, could coin money. Congress alone could levy duties and imposts. Congress alone could regulate trade between the states. So a number of these things were fixed. In addition to that, the framers of the Constitution, to make sure that this could actually meet the needs of the future and any other need that they didn't foresee, introduced what was called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It states, and I quote, to make all the Congress shall it has the power to, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States of America or in any department or office thereof. Over the years, this was used to grant to Congress powers that were not necessarily or specifically stated within the Constitution. So, for example, when you get into debates over health care, does Congress have the right to provide a health care system? When it comes to issues such as Social Security, does Congress have the right to establish a law that provides Social Security that's paid for in taxes by the people? When the Supreme Court rules on it, it always goes back to this. This clause is always important in their determination. Is it feasible? Is it logical that it's necessary for Congress to pass these laws to ensure things such as domestic tranquility, the health, the welfare of the general people? Well, you can definitely make an argument in favor of this. But as we'll see when we get to the Bill of Rights, there is a counter argument to the Necessary and Proper Clause. Now, they also included within the language the 3/5 compromise, but as a tip to the hat to the states that did not have slavery and to those people who viewed it as antithetical to Republican values, Enlightenment ideas, and no longer needed within their economy, they allowed the Congress to ban the slave trade after 1808. Now, Article 2 deals with the executive branch and its powers. And then which is, goes through all the rights that the president has, including being commander in chief and, negotiating treaties with foreign powers. And both of those two articles are pretty lengthy and very detailed. Article 3, on the other hand, deals with the judicial branch and was not very detailed because the framers really still hadn't determined what function or what shape it should take and what exactly are the extent of its powers. So they left that up to Congress to decide. So since then, Congress has followed the process of having a Supreme Court of the United States of America, and then under the Supreme Court having a tiered system of other courts that preside over civil cases, criminal cases. They have their appellate courts. This whole structure was brought into power as the representatives of the United States of America, many of whom were actually lawyers, saw a need. So even today, if Congress wanted to, they could go through and they could, we currently have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They could decide they only want 1, or they could decide that they want 20. It's up to Congress to make that decision. Now, Article 4 gave Congress the power to oversee federal territories, and in this, they basically gave Congress, and this was later reinforced by the Supreme Court in the insular cases, what's called plenary power, absolute power over all lands that the federal government owns that are not states. So there are only some limited restrictions that the insular cases placed on Congress. So, for example, Congress can't really pass laws in their territories, such as Guam today, that would infringe on basic human rights. And then finally, Article 7, it is what set up the system of ratifying the Constitution. Now, one article that I forgot in here, or one point that I forgot in here, was the ability to amend the Constitution. So they gave to Congress that ability, and they gave a process that included the state governments in amending it, which was very reflective of the experiences of the Constitutional Convention. Because what they wanted for this government to be is an organic government, an organic constitution, one that grew and changed as the ages passed. And that was how they met that desire to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So after that came the process of actually ratifying it. And as the timeline shows, ratifying took a little bit longer than expected to occur, because all the states, once they had this new document, they had to mull it over and decide, okay, do we want this thing? And in addition to that, they needed at least 9 states to ratify it before it actually went into power. In New Hampshire, it was the last of them, coming in on June 21st, 1788. And you can see that even after New Hampshire made it the official government, you still had some holdouts, with Rhode Island again appearing, not even choosing to ratify it until 1790. And this was the period of the Great Debate. You had on the one hand the Anti-Federalists, individuals like Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, George Clinton of New York, and Patrick Henry of Virginia, who viewed greatly with suspicion any form of centralized government. They viewed this as the first step towards tyranny, of going back to a monarchy. In addition to that, one thing that the Constitution, on the one hand, it did prevent society from moving back towards that old system by prohibiting Congress from doing things like granting titles of nobility, for example, and certain privileges to individuals. So that old aristocracy was dead in the Constitution. But one thing that was glaringly absent was a Bill of Rights. Since it existed at the state level, the Constitutional Convention didn't necessarily see it as essential. It was already protected at the state level. But the Anti-Federalists recognized, and wisely so, that you did need one at the federal level as well, to limit Congress's abilities when it came to the relationship between the individual citizen and the federal government. Now, there were the other groups on the that were known as the Federalists, and do not confuse them with the Federalists of the post-Washington era. This is Federalist with a small f. And these were individuals that recognized the need for centralized control, a federal structure to direct commerce and taxation, to provide direction to the country. And a series of papers were written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. 85 papers to be precise. So, I'm sorry, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, 85 letters to be precise, all under the pseudonym of Publius. And this was a common, literary tool used in this time period. You didn't publish under your own name. You published under a pseudonym when you engaged in public debate. And basically, they addressed all the concerns of the Anti-Federalists. One of the big questions was, or the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, was that you had to have a small republic if you were going to have a republic. And they looked back to Greece and to Rome, and all of history said that republics cannot be big. If you take a look at the Greek city-states, why did they succeed as being republics if they weren't monarchies? Well, it's because they were small. They were city-states. What happened with Rome? Well, it started as a republic, but as it conquered more land, it quickly became an empire with a Caesar sitting over a Senate. So all these questions and these concerns were addressed by the Federalists in these papers. And even today, they give us a lot of insight into the original intent of the framers of the Constitution, especially considering the fact that Alexander Hamilton and especially James Madison played such prominent roles during the course of the Constitutional Convention, even though John Jay himself was not there when it was drafted. In the end, it was embraced, it was accepted, and one of the first orders of business when the new Congress met was that they drafted the Bill of Rights. So they met in the Old City Hall of New York City, 1789. Washington was unanimously elected the president, and James Madison architected the Constitution. Future president of the United States of America sat down to this monumental task, and I say monumental task because initially over 210 different amendments were submitted by the various states and their delegates to Congress. Madison had to work through all of these, and he eventually whittled them down to 12 amendments. So from 210 amendments down to 12 amendments. And then through the various debates and committees in the House and Senate, they finally got those down to 10. So these are our Bill of Rights. Number one, freedom of assembly, press, religion. Number two, the one that's so controversial today, the right to form militias and bear arms. Number three, you can't quarter soldiers in houses. Number four, protection from search and seizure. That's that the police cannot just arbitrarily walk up and just start searching your stuff. Number five, no double jeopardy. This was crucial. Can't be tried for the same case twice. No forced testimony against yourself, and you have the right of due process of law. Habeas corpus, being able to see a judge. Number six, trial by jury, and a speedy trial at that. Although please don't confuse this with speedy trial meaning you get it right away. Even today, sometimes it can take years for a felony arrest or a misdemeanor to finally be resolved before a judge. Number seven, suits over issues valued over $20. It's pretty much civil court right here. Are guaranteed a jury trial, and no case tried by jury can be retried in other courts. Number eight, no excessive and unusual punishment. There's your Cesare Beccaria right there for you. Number nine, rights in the Constitution do not diminish other rights held by citizens. In other words, so for example, rights in the Constitution, if they're not as extensive as those, say, like granted by a state, it doesn't diminish those. And then here it is, number 10. Quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, end quote. So going back to necessary and proper, even today, if you ever wonder why a Democrat and a Republican can't agree on some issues such as health care and Social Security, there it is right there. On the one hand, you'll have one argument that says, hey, it is necessary, it is proper, for example, to pass the Affordable Health Care Act, Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act, because it's such a fundamental issue of the national economy. It deals with trade, it deals with the regulation of trade. It is something that goes straight towards the welfare of the people. Congress has this right, in the necessary and proper clause. But then you have the other side that argues, no, it does not say in black and white on that piece of paper that the United States government has the right to do this. And so what do we do in this situation? Enter the judicial branch. Now, keep in mind, at the time of framing of the Constitution, one of the biggest and most important powers of the judicial branch, one that has been proven to be instrumental in the function of our government, judicial review, had not been formulated yet. In fact, the United States government existed for at least a decade before that Supreme Court case came to fruition. But that is an issue, a topic for another video. So there you have it. When we look at the Articles of Confederation and the time period under it, once upon a time it used to be that your college and your high school textbook just right by it, just viewed it as kind of a mulligan out on the golf course. Best left unsaid and unaddressed. But when we look at that time period, it was a time period that's very rich in history, and in history that was important for the United States of America, because the United States learned some very invaluable lessons in this time period about what works and what does not work with the government. They learned in this time period that the state governments had the answer all along, but it was this reluctance on the part of the states to surrender power, this over suspicion on towards central government that kept them from embracing the solution that was there before them the whole time. But in the end, it took them about 7 years, but they came up with a solution, and to date, this solution has proven quite remarkable indeed.